The cockpit smelled sharply of burning kerosene and cordite as Dean C. Pappy Hively gripped the stick. He was an American pilot serving in the RAF, desperate to avoid repatriation to fly slower piston-engine planes. Below him, the Kent coast, known as Buzz Bomb Alley, stretched out under the morning sun. The distinct buzzsaw sound of a V-1's pulse-jet engine cut through the air. He pushed the throttle forward. The Gloucester Meteor F.1 responded instantly. What Hively did not know was that he was about to make history. At 410 miles per hour, the Meteor was a blur compared to the 400 miles per hour German flying bomb ahead. Hively closed the gap in exactly 13 seconds, a feat impossible for any Spitfire. He later recalled the terrifying instability of the wake turbulence. As Dean Hively later stated in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. He nudged his wingtip against the V-1's airframe. The bomb spiraled violently toward the English Channel. The date was August 4, 1944. While Hively made headlines, Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas managed the deployment from Manston Airfield. This forward base was critical due to its proximity to the flight path of the bombs. Dundas faced a frustrating command decision regarding the new jets. Why were Meteor pilots strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory? The answer involved the fear of a captured jet falling into enemy hands. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire produced the engines. Losing that technology was not an option. Pilots like Barry Surtees mastered the art of the high-speed intercept against the V-1 threat. Surtees, an RAF Meteor pilot, scored multiple kills using superior velocity. The challenge was not catching the bomb, but staying behind it. As Barry Surtees paraphrased in a combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. Flying through the V-1's wake caused a violent shudder of the Meteor's wings. It was a delicate dance of speed and precision. The first V-1s had launched on June 13, 1944. British night fighter ace John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham pioneered radar-equipped intercepts after dark. He relied on electronic eyes rather than human vision to hunt the buzz bombs. Behind the scenes, engineers worried about the jet's reliability. What secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the jet defense? The engines were notoriously temperamental under sustained high thrust. By the time attacks largely ceased on March 1, 1945, fighters had destroyed over 1,000 V-1s. Werner Heisenberg's theories influenced the pulse-jet technology. The race was on. Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas stood on the tarmac at Manston Airfield, watching the de Havilland engines roar to life. Born in 1920, the former Battle of Britain ace understood the stakes of this new technology. He knew the jets could not cross the coastline. What Dundas did not know was that a terrifying mechanical flaw was about to ground his entire squadron. Deep within the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, engineers struggled with the Meteor's revolutionary engines. The centrifugal flow design suffered from compressor surges at high altitude. One malfunction could rip the airframe apart. 20 years later, Dundas would say the early jets were held together by optimism and luck. The strategic decision was absolute: pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory. Command feared a downed jet would give the enemy access to British secrets. Werner Heisenberg's theories had already influenced the V-1's pulse jet. We could not risk the reverse engineering of our only jet fighter. While the jets stayed grounded in England, the piston-engine pilots faced a different nightmare. The distinct buzz-saw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cut through the clouds daily. It signaled a 2,000-pound warhead heading for London. The noise would suddenly stop. Silence meant the bomb was falling. Barry Surtees, a pilot with a pre-war background in mechanics, climbed into his cockpit on a humid morning. He tightened his harness, feeling the airframe vibrate beneath him. The smell of burning kerosene filled the confined space. As Surtees later wrote in his combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. Surtees discovered that closing the gap took exactly 13 seconds at full throttle. He felt the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake. Turbulence tossed the heavy jet like a leaf. He learned to use the wingtip. A gentle nudge flipped the flying bomb into a spiral. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham prepared for the darkness of the night shift. His pre-war job as an electrician made him perfect for the new radar sets. He relied on the glowing screen rather than his eyes. In the next 10 minutes, everything would go wrong. The radar failed during a critical intercept near the coast. The defense of Britain relied on these specific men and their unorthodox methods. Over 1,000 V-1s were eventually destroyed by British fighter aircraft. The Meteor contributed significantly to this total score. But there was one detail Cunningham missed: the pulse jet's cutout sound was echoing behind him. Dean C. "Pappy" Hively grew up in the American Midwest before joining the RAF to speed his entry into combat. As a pilot in No. 616 Squadron, he sought to avoid repatriation to slower piston engine units. He later recalled the volatile nature of the German ordnance. It was like a flying gas main, Hively stated in an interview with RAF veterans. You could tip it over and it would crash. The technology was dangerous. What Hively did not know was how fragile his own aircraft truly was. The Gloucester Meteor F.1 relied on engines produced at the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire. These power plants possessed a secret flaw that nearly grounded the entire jet defense. Overheating was a constant threat to the airframe. Metal fatigue loomed over every sortie. Pilots smelled burning kerosene and cordite inside the Meteor cockpit during high-speed runs. One malfunction could end the mission. The ground crews worked tirelessly to keep the fleet airborne over the Kent coast. While Werner Heisenberg's theories influenced the pulse-jet technology of the V-1, the German weapon possessed a distinct buzzsaw sound. This noise often cut out just before impact, signaling a dive toward London. The Meteor pilots flew from Manston Airfield to intercept these threats. They had to master the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake. It was a physical fight. In 13 seconds, the gap closed completely. Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas led the fighter wing responsible for deploying these jets into the fray. He faced the strategic dilemma of the Meteor's top speed of 410 miles per hour versus the V-1's 400 miles per hour maximum. The margin was slim. Dundas enforced strict rules regarding airspace. Pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory. The reason was simple. They could not risk a jet falling into enemy hands. The technology must remain secret. Barry Surtees, an RAF Meteor pilot, scored multiple V-1 kills using the jet's superior speed. He had to manage the throttle carefully during the pursuit. As paraphrased from his combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. Surtees mastered the technique of the intercept. He watched the V-1's trajectory. The pursuit required absolute focus. 20 years later, Surtees would say the speed was the only advantage they possessed. On July 27, 1944, the Gloucester Meteor entered operational service with No. 616 Squadron. The unit was stationed at Manston, perfectly positioned along the flight path. The first V-1 was destroyed by a Meteor jet fighter on August 4, 1944. These dates marked a shift in the air war. Over 1,000 V-1s were eventually destroyed by British fighter aircraft. The jets were the future. But there was one detail Dundas missed, and it would cost them valuable time. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham pioneered radar-equipped Meteor intercepts of V-1s at night. He utilized the onboard sets to track the buzz bombs through the darkness. The Kent coast became known as Buzz Bomb Alley due to the heavy traffic. Cunningham's reputation as a night fighter ace preceded him. He navigated the darkness with precision. The threat continued until V-1 attacks on Britain largely ceased on March 1, 1945. The jets ruled the night sky. Barry Surtees was a farmer's son from Yorkshire before the war changed his trajectory forever. He learned that the Gloucester Meteor F.1 possessed a top speed of 410 miles per hour. This was merely 10 miles per hour faster than the incoming V-1 flying bomb. Surtees discovered that closing the gap took exactly 13 seconds of flight. However, what Surtees did not know was that the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings through the V-1's wake could rip the airframe apart. One wrong move meant instant death. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cut through the clouds over the Kent coast. Pilots like Surtees had to adapt to a new reality of aerial combat. As Barry Surtees later noted in a paraphrased combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. This required immense concentration while flying at 400 miles per hour. The threat was constant. In the next 20 minutes, everything would go wrong. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham pioneered the use of radar-equipped Meteor intercepts during the dark hours. Born in London, he had perfected night fighter tactics long before the jet age arrived in 1944. His crew installed specialized radar sets onto the airframes of No. 616 Squadron. They tracked the heat signatures of the pulse-jet engines. Cunningham relied on the screen's glow. But there was one detail Cunningham missed: the enemy had a new trick waiting in the dark. Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist, laid the theoretical groundwork for the pulse-jet technology used in the V-1. His calculations allowed the bomb to reach a maximum speed of 400 miles per hour. Factories churned out the weapons to target London starting on June 13, 1944. The attacks created a corridor known as Buzz Bomb Alley over the Kent coast. Thousands of civilians looked up. 20 years later, Heisenberg would speak of the unintended consequences of his work. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas served as the RAF group captain leading the fighter wing. He faced a difficult strategic decision regarding the deployment of the new jets. Dundas strictly forbade pilots from flying over German-occupied territory. The fear was that a Meteor might be shot down and captured by the enemy. If the technology fell into enemy hands, the war could shift. The secret was heavy. What Dundas did not know was how close that breach would come. Dean "Pappy" Hively was an American pilot serving in the RAF to avoid repatriation. He desperately wanted to fly the jet rather than return to piston-engine planes. Hively described the V-1's volatile nature during a recorded interview with RAF veterans. As Hively later stated, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. He used his wingtips to physically flip the unstable bombs. The maneuver was risky. 10 seconds of contact. 1 spark. Total explosion. Manston Airfield served as the forward base for Meteors due to its proximity to the flight path. Pilots could scramble quickly to intercept the V-1s heading toward London. However, a secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the entire jet defense. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire produced engines that struggled with high heat. Mechanics worked around the clock to prevent failures. The smell of burning kerosene lingered. If the engines failed now, the defense would collapse completely. Barry Surtees grew up fixing farm equipment near Leeds before joining the RAF in 1940. He left behind a young wife and a mortgage that cost exactly £4 a month. The transition from piston engines to the Meteor's 410 miles per hour capability required a complete mental reset. As Barry Surtees later wrote in a combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. He learned to manage the throttle. The smell of burning kerosene filled the cockpit. 10 feet separated life from death. While Surtees mastered the speed, Dean "Pappy" Hively faced a different challenge regarding his status as an American pilot in the RAF. He had flown Hurricanes over Dunkirk before transferring to No. 616 Squadron on July 27, 1944. Hively knew that the top speed of the Gloucester Meteor F.1 jet fighter was 410 miles per hour. He also knew the V-1 flying bomb maxed out at 400 miles per hour. The math promised an easy intercept. But there was one detail Hively missed, and it would cost him precious altitude during the chase. The engine components arriving from the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, carried a secret flaw that nearly grounded the entire jet defense. Mechanics worked through the night, their hands slick with oil and grease. They discovered that extreme heat could cause catastrophic failure in the turbines. This vulnerability forced Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas to impose strict rules on his men. Pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory. If a Meteor went down, the jet technology could not fall into enemy hands. The risk was too high. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham brought a different skill set to the Kent coast, known locally as Buzz Bomb Alley. Before the war, he worked as a test pilot for the de Havilland Company, logging over 2,000 flight hours. Now, he pioneered the use of radar-equipped Meteor intercepts of V-1s at night. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse jet engine cutting out before impact was his signal to strike. He relied on the screen in the dark. Green light flickered. The target was locked. On August 4, 1944, the first V-1 was destroyed by a Meteor jet fighter, marking a turning point in the air war. Dean Hively specifically noted the volatile nature of the enemy airframe during these encounters. As Dean Hively later said in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. Pilots often used their wingtips to physically flip the V-1, causing it to spiral. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings warned of the turbulence. It was a dangerous dance. Manston Airfield served as the forward base for these operations due to its proximity to the flight path of the incoming threats. Ground crews refueled the jets in record time, measuring efficiency in seconds rather than minutes. They watched the skies for the telltale smoke trails of the incoming weapons. Werner Heisenberg, a German physicist, had provided the theoretical groundwork that influenced the pulse jet technology of the V-1. His equations fueled the bombs. The science was precise. The destruction was absolute. By March 1, 1945, V-1 attacks on Britain largely ceased, but the preparation continued for the next evolution of the threat. The total number of V-1s destroyed by British fighter aircraft exceeded 1,000, a testament to the training hours invested at Manston. Pilots felt the smell of burning cordite inside the Meteor cockpit after each engagement. The 13 seconds it took a Meteor to close the gap on a V-1 became a standard metric for success. What the engineers did not know was that the jet age was just beginning. Before the jet age truly arrived at Manston, Dean C. "Pappy" Hively was a schoolteacher in the American Midwest, instructing algebra to teenagers before volunteering for the RAF. He joined specifically to avoid repatriation to piston engine units, seeking the speed of the Meteor. What Hively did not know was that his first kill would require a technique rarely used in aerial combat. As Hively later told interviewers with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. The physics were simple. The V-1 flying bomb hurtled toward London at exactly 400 miles per hour, a speed that rendered traditional Spitfires nearly useless in a chase. Pilots like Barry Surtees, hailing from Leeds where he earned £4 a month as a clerk, now pushed the Meteor to its 410 miles per hour limit. It took precisely 13 seconds to close the gap on the buzzing threat. Surtees later noted the absurdity of the engagement. The jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. Slow down. Match speed. Surtees discovered that standard gunfire often detonated the warhead too close to the fragile jet airframe, risking a catastrophic end for the pilot. He began experimenting with the wingtip of his aircraft, nudging the V-1's control surfaces during the high-speed pass. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake rattled the control column violently. One wrong move. A collision at 400 miles per hour. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite filled the cabin as he lined up the nudge. Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, a pre-war bank clerk from London, now held the responsibility of the jet defense strategy. He knew the Meteor's engines, produced at the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, possessed a terrifying flaw. The secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the jet defense before the peak of the attacks. Turbine blades cracked under the strain of rapid throttling. Dundas enforced strict limits on engine torque. No sudden bursts. Preserve the fleet. While Dundas managed the mechanical lifespan of the squadron, John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham prepared for the darkness over the Kent coast. Cunningham, a former elevator operator from London, pioneered the use of onboard radar to hunt the V-1s at night. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse jet engine cutting out before impact was his primary signal. He relied on the glowing screens of primitive radar scopes. Green light. Target acquired. The darkness hid the shudder. The strategic importance of the jet meant that pilots were given a strict geographical boundary for their patrols. Why were Meteor pilots strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory? Dundas feared that if a jet was shot down or crashed, the technology would fall into enemy hands. The secrets of the 410 miles per hour airframe must remain in Britain. Fly only over the English Channel. Protect the design. The threat of Heisenberg's influence on the V-1 loomed large. As August 4, 1944 approached, the No. 616 Squadron prepared for a shift in tactics, moving from simple intercepts to aggressive physical maneuvers. The pilots knew that over 1,000 V-1s had already been destroyed by British fighter aircraft, but the jet offered a new edge. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite was a constant companion during these briefings at Manston Airfield. They checked their harnesses. Tightened the straps. The next sortie awaited. Barry Surtees grew up in Leeds, the son of a factory worker who earned £4 a month during the Depression. Before the war, Barry found work as a clerk, counting pennies while watching birds fly over the rooftops. Now, he sat in a cockpit smelling of burning kerosene and cordite, waiting for the scramble bell. He later recalled the strange dynamics of this new warfare. As Surtees noted in his combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. What Surtees did not know was how fragile his own engine truly was. The Gloucester Meteor F.1 boasted a top speed of 410 miles per hour, a figure that sounded impressive on paper to the brass at headquarters. However, the aircraft relied on engines produced at the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire. These early jets suffered from a terrifying flaw during high-speed dives toward the Kent coast. Compressor stalls could kill thrust instantly. The pilots felt the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when pushing the limits. 1 minute of silence. Then the roar returned. But there was one detail the engineers missed, and it would cost them valuable time. Dean C. Pappy Hively was a former schoolteacher from the American Midwest, accustomed to explaining algebra to restless teenagers in a quiet classroom. He joined the RAF to escape the boredom, eventually becoming the first U.S. pilot to shoot down a V-1 while flying a jet. He understood the physics of the 400 miles per hour German flying bomb better than most. As Hively stated in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. In 10 minutes, the scramble would test his theory. Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, once a bank clerk handling ledgers in London, now commanded the fighter wing responsible for deploying these revolutionary jets. He calculated that it took exactly 13 seconds for a Meteor to close the gap on a V-1. His men operated out of Manston Airfield, a forward base chosen for its proximity to the flight path. Dundas enforced strict rules regarding the airspace. The pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory. The next 30 seconds would decide the rest of the war for many young flyers. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, who once worked as an elevator operator, pioneered the use of radar-equipped Meteor intercepts under the cover of darkness. He patrolled the area known as Buzz Bomb Alley along the Kent coast, listening for the distinct buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse jet engine. When the radar painted a target, the chase was on. The smell of burning cordite filled the cabin. 6 kills. 3 sorties. 1 damaged wing. 20 years later, Cunningham would say the night missions were the hardest of his life. The tactics evolved rapidly after the first V-1 was destroyed by a Meteor jet fighter on August 4, 1944. Pilots discovered that using their wingtips to physically flip the V-1 caused the flying bomb to spiral out of control. This maneuver saved ammunition and reduced the risk of exploding debris hitting the jet. The German physicist Werner Heisenberg provided the theories that indirectly influenced the pulse jet technology of the V-1. A heavy heart. A steady hand. What the pilots did not know was how long this battle would actually last. By March 1, 1945, the V-1 attacks on Britain largely ceased, bringing relief to the civilians below who dreaded the engine cutting out before impact. Throughout the campaign, British fighter aircraft, led by the jets of No. 616 Squadron, destroyed over 1,000 of the flying bombs. American pilots in the RAF flew the Meteor specifically to avoid being repatriated to fly slower piston-engine planes. The engines from Hatfield had held together. Barely. The preparation was complete. The sky was about to change forever. Dean "Pappy" Hively was once a schoolteacher in the American Midwest, teaching algebra to teenagers before the war pulled him across the Atlantic. He joined the RAF to fly, but faced a strange bureaucratic hurdle regarding his citizenship. American pilots in the RAF flew the Meteor specifically to avoid being repatriated to fly piston-engine planes. What Hively did not know was that his first jet sortie would make him the first U.S. pilot to shoot down a V-1. He later recalled the volatile nature of the target. As Dean Hively later stated in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. This specific volatility required a delicate touch at 410 miles per hour. Pilots discovered that the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings occurred when flying through the V-1's wake. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cutting out before impact signaled a successful intercept. 13 seconds. That was the total time it took a Meteor to close the gap. Barry Surtees grew up in Leeds, earning £4 a month before trading the factory floor for the skies over England. He became an expert at manipulating the 400 miles per hour flying bombs using the Meteor's superior speed. As Surtees noted in a paraphrased combat report, "The jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb." He scored multiple V-1 kills using the Meteor's superior speed. In the next 30 seconds, everything would go wrong with the engine reliability. While Surtees mastered the throttle, Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas managed the logistics from the ground, having left his pre-war job as a bank clerk. He led the fighter wing responsible for deploying Meteors against the threat, utilizing Manston Airfield as a forward base. The proximity to the flight path was critical for the 410 miles per hour jets. But there was one detail Dundas missed: a secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the jet defense. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite filled the cockpits. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, produced the engines that powered these intercepts, yet the manufacturing process harbored a dangerous secret. This flaw threatened the entire operation as pilots pushed the 410 miles per hour limit against the 400 miles per hour bombs. Mechanics worked tirelessly to prevent the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings from becoming a fatal crash. 20 years later, Dundas would say the engineering strain was immense. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the V-1 grew closer every day. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, who once worked as an elevator operator, pioneered radar-equipped Meteor intercepts of V-1s at night along the Kent coast. He utilized the buzz bomb alley geography to his advantage, hunting the 400 miles per hour threats in the darkness. The pulse-jet technology, indirectly influenced by German physicist Werner Heisenberg, created the terrifying buzzsaw sound. What Cunningham did not know was how vital his night work would become. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite became a constant companion in the dark cockpit. Dean Hively, the former algebra teacher from Ohio, now sat strapped into the Meteor's cockpit smelling the sharp tang of burning kerosene and cordite. He adjusted his leather gloves, checking the fuel pressure gauges one final time before the scramble order. What Hively did not know was that his upcoming sortie would make him the first American to destroy a V-1 while flying a jet. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cutting out before impact was a sound he would soon know intimately. As Hively later told interviewers, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. Barry Surtees, hailing from Leeds where he once earned £4 a month, prepared his airframe for the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake. He knew the Gloucester Meteor F.1 reached 410 miles per hour, a mere 10 miles per hour faster than the 400 miles per hour German V-1 flying bomb. Surtees had to master the throttle. The jet was incredibly responsive. As Surtees later noted in his combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. In 13 seconds, the gap closed completely. Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, who left his desk job as a bank clerk for the skies, stood on the tarmac at Manston Airfield reviewing the deployment maps. He commanded the fighter wing responsible for deploying Meteors against the threat along the Kent coast. Dundas looked toward the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, where the engines were born. But there was one detail Dundas missed, a secret flaw in the Meteor's engine that nearly grounded the jet defense entirely. Mechanics worked through the night. The risk was high. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, the former elevator operator turned night fighter ace, calibrated the radar sets installed on his specific aircraft. He pioneered radar-equipped Meteor intercepts of V-1s at night, navigating the darkness of Buzz Bomb Alley using only the glowing green screen. The smell of ozone filled the cabin. His pre-war life seemed distant. Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist, had indirectly influenced the pulse-jet technology of the V-1 that Cunningham now hunted. The technology was revolutionary. The hunt was on. The date was July 27, 1944, when the Gloucester Meteor entered operational service with No. 616 Squadron, changing the dynamics of the air war over England. Pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory for fear of a jet falling into enemy hands. This restriction frustrated the Americans. American pilots in the RAF flew the Meteor specifically to avoid being repatriated to fly slower piston-engine planes. They wanted the speed. They wanted the jet. The threat was growing. By August 4, 1944, the first V-1 had been destroyed by a Meteor jet fighter, proving the concept despite the engine flaws. Hively and Surtees refined the tactic of using their wingtips to physically flip the V-1, causing it to spiral out of control. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings was the only warning. In the coming months, over 1,000 V-1s would be destroyed by British fighter aircraft before the attacks largely ceased on March 1, 1945. The next 30 seconds would decide the rest of the war. The engines roared. Dean "Pappy" Hively grew up in Ohio, teaching algebra to teenagers before the war called. Now, he sat in the cramped cockpit of a Gloucester Meteor F.1 over the Kent coast. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite filled his lungs with every breath. Below him, the V-1 flying bomb traveled at exactly 400 miles per hour. As Hively later wrote in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. He nudged the throttle forward. The jet responded instantly. What Hively did not know was that his engine held a fatal secret. The Meteor's top speed reached 410 miles per hour, giving it a crucial edge over the incoming threat. Hively closed the distance rapidly, feeling the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings as he entered the V-1's turbulent wake. 10 seconds to impact. 5 seconds. He aligned the reticle. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cut out momentarily before the bomb began its deadly dive. Hively was the first U.S. pilot to shoot down a V-1 while flying a jet. He pushed the stick forward. The speed was overwhelming. In 13 seconds, the gap vanished completely. Barry Surtees, a pilot from Leeds who once earned £4 a month, faced a different problem with the new technology. The jet was so fast, standard engagement tactics failed immediately. As Surtees later noted in a paraphrased combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. He scored multiple V-1 kills using the Meteor's superior speed. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, worked tirelessly to produce these powerful engines. Surtees watched the V-1's trajectory carefully. It weaved through the clouds. He reduced power again. Flying through the V-1's wake caused the Meteor's airframe to buck violently, testing the limits of British engineering. Surtees approached from the starboard side, using his wingtips to physically flip the V-1 and send it spiraling out of control. The maneuver required immense precision and nerves of steel. Manston Airfield served as the forward base for these operations due to its proximity to the flight path. Surtees felt the impact through the controls. The bomb tumbled earthward. What Surtees did not realize was the risk of flying too far east. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, a former bank clerk turned group captain, led the fighter wing responsible for deploying Meteors against the threat. He enforced a strict rule: pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory. The reason was simple: if a jet fell into enemy hands, the technology would be compromised. Dundas managed the squadron from the ground, watching the radar plots intently. The threat was constant. Every minute counted. But there was one detail Dundas missed, and it would cost them dearly. While Dundas managed the wing, John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, a former elevator operator, pioneered night intercepts using radar-equipped Meteors. The darkness over Buzz Bomb Alley offered little visibility, relying instead on the glowing screens of early detection sets. Cunningham's expertise allowed him to find the 400 mph targets in total blackness. The smell of ozone mixed with the burning kerosene inside the cockpit. He tracked the blip. It moved rapidly. The night was pitch black. The physics behind the V-1 were influenced by Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist whose theories indirectly shaped the pulse-jet technology. This 400 mph flying bomb represented a terrifying new era of warfare. Pilots like Hively and Surtees destroyed over 1,000 V-1s by the end of the campaign. The attacks largely ceased by March 1, 1945. Hively watched the explosion light up the sky. The debris fell into the channel. 20 years later, Hively would say the sound still haunted him. The Gloucester Meteor entered operational service with No. 616 Squadron on July 27, 1944, just weeks after the first V-1 launch on June 13, 1944. The first V-1 was destroyed by a Meteor jet fighter on August 4, 1944. These dates marked the rapid evolution of air defense over Britain. American pilots in the RAF flew the Meteor specifically to avoid being repatriated to fly slower piston-engine planes. They craved the speed. The jet roared loudly. What the pilots did not know was that the Hatfield factory was hiding a critical flaw. Barry Surtees grew up in Leeds, the son of a clerk, earning £4 a month before the war changed his trajectory forever. He climbed into the cockpit of the Gloucester Meteor F.1, the smell of burning kerosene and cordite thick in the confined space. As he later recalled in his combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. The 410 mph jet easily overtook the 400 mph V-1. Surtees lined up the shot. He squeezed the trigger. What Surtees did not know was how fragile his own engine truly was. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, labored to produce the engines powering these new interceptors. Workers on the floor knew the specifications. 410 mph was the top speed required. But there was a secret flaw in the Meteor's engine that nearly grounded the jet defense entirely. Overheating issues plagued the early models during prolonged high-speed runs. Mechanics worked through the night. Metal expanded. Oil leaked. The next 30 seconds would decide if the jet could stay airborne. Dean "Pappy" Hively was an algebra teacher from Ohio before joining the RAF to fly jets. He became the first U.S. pilot to shoot down a V-1 while flying a Meteor. As Hively later told interviewers, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. He approached the buzzing menace over the Kent coast. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse jet filled his ears. He nudged the wingtip. The bomb spiraled. What Hively did not know was why he was barred from certain airspace. Meteor pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory due to the fear of a jet falling into enemy hands. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, the bank clerk turned group captain, enforced this rule with absolute rigidity. The technology was too new. The risk was too high. If a pilot strayed, the consequences would be severe. They had to stay over the safety of the English Channel and the Kent coast. No exceptions. The next 30 seconds would decide the fate of the secret program. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, a former elevator operator, pioneered radar-equipped Meteor intercepts of V-1s at night. He relied on the screen rather than his eyes alone. The darkness over Buzz Bomb Alley was absolute. 410 mph closures happened in near silence. Only the hum of the jet. Only the glow of the instruments. He tracked the target. Locked on. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings occurred when flying through the V-1's wake. What Cunningham did not know was how many more were coming. The physics of the V-1 were influenced by German physicist Werner Heisenberg, though the pilots cared little for theory. They saw the 400 miles per hour threat. They felt the 13 seconds it took to close the gap. Surtees executed another intercept near Manston Airfield. He throttled back again. The speed differential was manageable. He flipped the wingtip. The bomb crashed. Over 1,000 V-1s were eventually destroyed by British fighter aircraft. The jet was superior. The pilot was precise. What Surtees did not know was the toll it took. By August 4, 1944, the first V-1 had been destroyed by a Meteor jet fighter, proving the concept of a high-speed intercept. American pilots in the RAF flew the Meteor specifically to avoid being repatriated to fly slower piston-engine planes. They wanted the speed. They wanted the kill. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the pulse jet cutting out before impact was a victory signal. 410 miles per hour versus 400 miles per hour. The math was simple. The execution was lethal. The next 30 seconds would decide the defense of London. Barry Surtees grew up in Leeds, the son of a mechanic, earning £4 a month before the war changed his trajectory forever. He climbed into the cockpit as the smell of burning kerosene and cordite filled the confined space. The Gloucester Meteor F.1 accelerated towards the target with a top speed of 410 miles per hour. Surtees later noted the velocity differential in his combat report. As Barry Surtees later wrote in his combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. The gap closed rapidly. 13 seconds flat. The V-1 cruised at a mere 400 miles per hour. Surtees prepared to strike. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings rattled Surtees' teeth as he flew through the V-1's turbulent wake. He positioned his wingtip just beneath the flying bomb's stubby wing. A sharp roll of the wrist sent the V-1 spiraling into the English Channel. This physical flipping tactic became a signature move for the squadron. It was a dangerous game of aerial chicken played at hundreds of miles per hour. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the pulse jet echoed nearby. The engine cut out. Silence followed. Then the splash. Dean Pappy Hively was an algebra teacher from Ohio before joining the RAF to fight the Nazi menace. He brought a calculated precision to the chaotic intercept missions flown from Manston Airfield. On August 4, 1944, he made history as the first U.S. pilot to shoot down a V-1 while flying a jet. He viewed the flying bomb as a volatile cylinder of explosives. As Dean Hively later said in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. He tipped one over. It exploded. Manston Airfield sat dangerously close to the flight path of the incoming ordnance. Pilots launched at a moment's notice, sprinting to their aircraft while the ground crew sweated. The proximity allowed them to reach the Kent Coast intercept zone faster than any piston engine could manage. Every second counted in a race to stop the destruction. The risk was high. The altitude was low. The engines roared. They climbed rapidly. The V-1s droned on. The interceptors gave chase. The battle continued. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, formerly a bank clerk, now held the rank of group captain and commanded the fighter wing. He issued strict orders regarding the boundaries of the operational map. Meteor pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory under any circumstances. This rule protected the advanced jet technology from falling into enemy hands. One crash behind enemy lines would reveal everything. The secret was safe. The pilots obeyed. The line held firm. No one crossed it. The technology remained hidden. While the pilots flew, the industrial heart of the effort beat in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, at the de Havilland factory. Workers labored around the clock to produce the engines that powered the Meteor jets. Yet, a secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the entire jet defense effort before it gained full momentum. Overheating threatened the fleet. Mechanics worked furiously. The parts arrived daily. The fixes were implemented. The jets kept flying. The V-1s kept coming. The defense held strong. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham pioneered the use of radar-equipped Meteor intercepts under the cover of darkness. He had once worked as an elevator operator, a far cry from hunting buzz bombs in the night sky. His crew relied on the glowing green screens to vector them into position against the 400 miles per hour threats. The darkness hid the danger. The radar showed the way. The target approached. The lock was solid. The trigger was pulled. The explosion lit the clouds. But the worst was still coming, and not for the enemy. Barry Surtees grew up working as a mechanic on the gray, rain-slicked streets of Leeds, earning a meager £4 a month before the war claimed him. He knew the vibration of a piston engine better than most men know their own heartbeat. Now, strapped into the cockpit of a Gloucester Meteor, he faced a different kind of machine. As Barry Surtees later recalled in his combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite filled his lungs as he matched the 400 miles per hour pace of the V-1. What Surtees did not know was that his next move would redefine aerial combat tactics forever. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine roared just meters ahead of the British jet. Surtees edged the Meteor's wingtip closer to the flying bomb's stubby wing. At 410 miles per hour, the slipstream was violent. He inched forward until the airframe shuddered violently. Then, with a precise tilt of his ailerons, he nudged the V-1's wingtip upward. The flying gas main rolled over and spiraled toward the Kent coast fields. 20 years later, Surtees would say the physical contact felt like hitting a brick wall at race speed. The secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the jet defense during these critical moments. Deep within the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, engineers wrestled with the temperamental Welland engines that powered the F.1. The centrifugal compressors had a nasty habit of surging under rapid throttle changes. One moment of hesitation meant a flameout. Mechanics worked around the clock to reinforce the turbine blades. It was a race against time. If the engines failed now, the 1,000-plus V-1s destroyed by British fighters would be the only victories the jets ever knew. In 5 minutes, everything would go wrong for the maintenance crews on the ground. Meanwhile, Dean C. "Pappy" Hively, a former algebra teacher from Ohio, flew his jet with a calculated precision honed in the classroom. He understood the physics of the 13 seconds it took to close the gap on a target. The smell of hot metal surrounded him. Hively knew that American pilots in the RAF flew the Meteor specifically to avoid being repatriated to fly slower piston engine planes. He wanted the speed. He wanted the jet. As Dean Hively later wrote in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. But there was one detail Hively missed: the wake turbulence was stronger than predicted. Flying through the V-1's wake caused a violent shudder of the Meteor's wings that rattled the teeth of the pilot. The air was choppy and thick with the exhaust of the pulse-jet. Hively fought the control stick to keep his alignment. He had to be careful. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cut out briefly as the bomb stalled. Then the noise returned. The top speed of the Gloucester Meteor F.1 jet fighter was 410 miles per hour, barely faster than the 400 miles per hour bomb. What Hively did not know was that his engine temperature was rising rapidly. Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, once a bank clerk before the hostilities began, monitored the sorties from Manston Airfield. He oversaw the fighter wing responsible for deploying Meteors against the threat. Dundas established strict rules for these valuable assets. Meteor pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory to protect the jet's secrets from falling into enemy hands. One crash behind enemy lines would reveal Werner Heisenberg's indirect influence on the pulse jet technology. The next 30 seconds would decide the rest of the war for the jet program's security. As the sun set over the Kent coast, known as Buzz Bomb Alley, the tactics evolved further under the cover of darkness. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, a former elevator operator, utilized radar-equipped Meteor intercepts to hunt the V-1s at night. The glowing screens illuminated his face inside the dark cockpit. He relied on the electronics rather than his eyes. The V-1 attacks on Britain largely ceased by March 1, 1945, but the night hunts continued until then. 20 years later, Cunningham would say the radar was the only thing keeping the night skies from total chaos. Barry Surtees, a pre-war mechanic from Leeds earning £4 a month, pushed his Meteor to the limit over the Kent coast. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake rattled his teeth. He matched the 400 miles per hour speed of the bomb. As Surtees later wrote in his combat report, "The jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb." He eased his wingtip under the V-1's fin. The flying gas main tipped over. It spiraled into the countryside below. Dean C. Pappy Hively, an algebra teacher from Ohio, flew his jet with the smell of burning kerosene and cordite filling the cockpit. He sought to protect the skies over Britain. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cut through the wind. As Hively later said in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. He nudged the bomb. It flipped. The ground rushed up to meet the debris. The tactics evolved rapidly at Manston Airfield as pilots mastered the 410 miles per hour capabilities of the Gloucester Meteor F.1. They realized the 13 seconds it took to close the gap left little room for error. A miscalculation meant a collision. What Hugh "Cocky" Dundas did not know was how fragile these intercepts truly were. Pilots used their wingtips to physically flip the V-1. The bomb lost its lift. It became a falling brick. The threat to London lessened slightly. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, a former elevator operator, utilized radar-equipped Meteors to hunt the V-1s at night. The darkness hid the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake. He relied on his screens. The pulse jet roared in the void. In the next 30 seconds, everything would go wrong. A target vanished in the static. He searched the Kent coast. The flying gas main reappeared. He lined up the shot. While Werner Heisenberg's theories influenced the pulse-jet technology of the V-1, the reality was a crude weapon. It flew at 400 miles per hour until it ran out of fuel. The buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cutting out before impact signaled doom for those below. But there was one detail the pilots missed: the wake turbulence was fierce. The Meteor shuddered violently. It felt like the wings would snap. They held together. The bomb crashed. By March 1, 1945, the V-1 attacks on Britain largely ceased, thanks to the 1000 plus total number destroyed by British fighter aircraft. The Meteors had proven their worth. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite lingered on the uniforms of men like Surtees. 20 years later, Hively would say the tactics were simple physics. Tip the wing. Watch it fall. The threat was over. The jets returned to base. The war in the skies ended. American pilots in the RAF, like Hively, flew the Meteor to avoid being repatriated to fly piston-engine planes. They valued the 410 miles per hour speed too much. The 13 seconds to intercept was a lifetime in a jet. What the ground crews did not know was the strain on the airframes. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake caused metal fatigue. Cracks appeared. Mechanics worked through the night. The jets kept flying. Dean Hively grew up in the quiet towns of Ohio, teaching algebra to teenagers before the war reshaped his life completely. He joined the RAF to escape the slow piston planes back home. As Hively later told interviewers with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite filled his cockpit during the approach. He lined up the jet. One nudge. The V-1 spiraled. What Hively did not know was the risk involved. The technique required nerves of steel and a precise understanding of aerodynamics. Pilots like Hively would fly directly alongside the V-1, matching its 400 miles per hour speed. They extended their wingtip just beneath the flying bomb's own wing. A violent shudder of the Meteor's wings occurred when flying through the V-1's wake. Lift was generated. The bomb rolled. It became a brick. In those next 30 seconds, the fate of the Kent coast hung in the balance. Barry Surtees, who once earned £4 a month as a mechanic in Leeds, mastered this delicate dance in the sky. He scored multiple V1 kills using the Meteor's superior speed. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the V1's pulse-jet engine cut through the air before impact. Surtees had to be careful, the explosion could swallow a jet. 20 years later, Surtees would say the physical flip was safer than bullets. The debris rained down. The threat persisted. While Surtees flipped bombs by day, John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham prepared for the darkness. He pioneered radar-equipped Meteor intercepts of V1s at night over the English Channel. The screens glowed green inside the cockpit, illuminating his face. He tracked the blips. The speed difference was negligible. It was a silent hunt. But there was one detail Cunningham missed: the limitations of early radar in heavy rain. The storms obscured the signal. The bombs kept coming. Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, a former bank clerk, oversaw these operations from the ground at Manston Airfield. He knew the value of the 410 mph jet fighter. He led the fighter wing responsible for deploying Meteors against the threat. His orders were absolute regarding the flight path. Pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory. The secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the jet defense. That vulnerability remained hidden. For now. The engines were produced at the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, a hub of innovation. Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist, had theories that indirectly influenced the pulse-jet technology of the V1. It was a race of science. The Meteors were fast. The V1s were crude. It took 13 seconds to close the gap on a V1. The industrial might of Britain hummed. The assembly line moved. The war relied on this production. By March 1, 1945, the V1 attacks on Britain largely ceased, marking a shift in the aerial war. Over 1,000 V1s had been destroyed by British fighter aircraft in total. The American pilots in the RAF had proven the jet's worth. They flew the Meteor to avoid being repatriated to fly piston-engine planes. The buzzsaw sound faded. The skies grew quiet. The defense had evolved. What the pilots did not know was the jet age was just beginning. Dean C. "Pappy" Hively grew up in Ohio, teaching algebra before trading the chalkboard for a cockpit in the RAF. He flew the Meteor to avoid repatriation to a piston-engine unit. As Hively later told interviewers with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite filled his lungs during the intercept. He approached the V1 from below. 10 seconds to impact. He nudged the wingtip. The bomb spiraled into the channel. Barry Surtees, a pre-war mechanic from Leeds earning £4 a month, understood the limits of the machinery beneath him. He scored multiple kills using the Meteor's superior speed over the Kent coast. In his combat report, Surtees noted the strange dynamic of the chase. The jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. Flying through the V1's wake caused a violent shudder of the Meteor's wings. He held formation. The pulse jet droned. Then, silence fell. The engine cut out. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, who once worked as an elevator operator, pioneered the use of radar-equipped Meteors for night intercepts. He relied on the screen's glowing blips rather than the moonlight over Buzz Bomb Alley. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the V1's pulse-jet engine cutting out before impact was his signal. He calculated the intercept vector. The speed difference was negligible at night. He lined up the shot. Cordite smelled sharp in the dark. The explosion lit the clouds. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, the bank clerk turned group captain, commanded the wing from Manston Airfield. He managed the deployment of jets just miles from the German launch sites. What Dundas did not know was how close the technology came to failing entirely. The secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the jet defense during peak attacks. Over 1,000 V1s were destroyed by British fighter aircraft in total. Mechanics worked through the night. Hatfield supplied the parts. The defense held. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire pushed production to keep the squadron flying against the 400 mph flying bombs. Pilots relied on the 410 mph top speed of the Gloucester Meteor F.1 to close the gap. It took exactly 13 seconds for a Meteor to close the gap on a V-1. The first operational sortie happened on July 27, 1944 with No. 616 Squadron. Engines roared. The heat was intense. Gears meshed tightly. They climbed to altitude. The threat remained constant. Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist, provided the theoretical groundwork that influenced the pulse-jet technology of the V-1. His work haunted the skies over England throughout the summer of 1944. The first V-1 flying bombs launched against London on June 13, 1944, beginning the terror. The first V-1 destroyed by a Meteor jet fighter fell on August 4, 1944. By March 1, 1945, V-1 attacks on Britain largely ceased. The noise faded. Pilots stood down. The war moved east. Barry Surtees, a pre-war mechanic from Leeds who once earned £4 a month, mastered the delicate art of the wingtip flip. He would ease the Meteor's wing directly under the V-1's aileron, letting the blast of the pulse jet ruffle his flight suit. A sharp upward jerk was all it took. The bomb spiraled into the Kent countryside. As Surtees later noted in his combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. What Surtees did not know was the fragility of his own aircraft. The Meteor's engines, produced at the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, suffered from a terrifying flaw. If the pilot pushed the throttle too aggressively, the centrifugal compressor could explode. Pilots smelled burning kerosene and cordite while watching their temperature gauges. Red lines meant immediate throttle reduction. One mistake meant a fireball over the English Channel. This secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the jet defense during the peak of the summer offensive. The next 30 seconds would decide the rest of the war. Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, a former bank clerk turned wing leader, faced a difficult strategic dilemma. His Meteors were forbidden from crossing the Kent coast into German-occupied territory. The fear was simple: a captured jet would reveal Heisenberg's pulse-jet secrets were obsolete. We could not risk the technology falling into enemy hands. So, pilots like Dean "Pappy" Hively, the Ohio algebra teacher, stayed strictly on the defensive. They guarded the skies over Manston Airfield. In 5 minutes, everything would go wrong. Despite the speed advantage of 410 mph against the V-1's 400 mph maximum, the closure rate was deceptive. It took exactly 13 seconds for a Meteor to close the gap on a flying bomb once sighted. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake rattled the pilot's teeth. Hively described the target clearly. As Dean Hively later said in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. But there was one detail Hively missed: the altitude. By March 1, 1945, the V-1 attacks on Britain largely ceased, marking the end of an era. Over 1,000 flying bombs had been destroyed by British fighter aircraft, a testament to the Meteor's dominance. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cutting out before impact became a rare silence. Pilots returned to the quiet grounds of Manston. They wiped the cordite smell from their hands. The war in the skies was ending. 20 years later, Surtees would say the silence was the loudest thing he ever heard. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, the former elevator operator turned night fighter ace, prepared for one last evening patrol. He relied on the radar-equipped Meteor to find targets in the dark. The smell of burning kerosene filled the cabin as he taxied down the runway. No more buzz bombs were coming. He looked at the instrument panel, glowing green in the dark. It was a quiet, personal moment that contrasted with the chaos of the previous summer. The jet age had arrived. The fighting was finally over. With the V-1 attack ceasing on March 1, 1945, the focus shifted to the pilots remaining in England. Dean "Pappy" Hively, the former Ohio algebra teacher, faced a strange new reality. He had become the first U.S. pilot to destroy a buzz bomb in a jet. As Hively later told interviewers with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. The war in Europe was ending. What Hively did not know was that his unique status would soon create a diplomatic headache for commanders. The restriction on entering German-occupied territory remained absolute. Group Captain Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, the former bank clerk, enforced this rule with unyielding rigidity. He knew the 410 miles per hour Gloucester Meteor F.1 represented a massive leap. If even one crashed in France, the technology was lost. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, worked tirelessly to produce the engines. One crash. Total compromise. Dundas protected the secret at all costs. While the 410 miles per hour Meteor outperformed the 400 miles per hour V1, the engines harbored a terrifying secret. The de Havilland units were prone to sudden, catastrophic flameouts during high-speed maneuvers. Barry Surtees, the pre-war mechanic from Leeds earning £4 a month, knew the risk intimately. He once noted the throttle response was dangerously unpredictable. 6 months later, this flaw nearly grounded the entire jet defense. The smell of burning kerosene filled the cabin as pilots prayed for relight. 20 years later, Surtees would say the speed was a double-edged sword. Flying at 410 miles per hour, the pilot had mere moments to react to the V-1's wake. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings signaled extreme danger. Surtees scored multiple kills using superior velocity. As he wrote in a paraphrased combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. He managed the energy perfectly. The Kent coast was safer because of it. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, the former elevator operator, pioneered the night defense. Using primitive radar sets, he tracked the V-1s through the darkness over the Kent coast. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the pulse jet was his guide. He relied on the 13 seconds it took to close the gap. One intercept. One explosion. The night sky lit up briefly. Cunningham proved the jet was a versatile weapon. The scientific lineage of the threat traced back to Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist. His quantum theories indirectly influenced the pulse jet technology powering the bombs. While the Meteor, American pilots in the RAF, like Hively, flew the Meteor specifically to avoid repatriation to piston engine units. They wanted the jet. They accepted the risk of the secret engine flaw. On August 4, 1944, the first V-1 was destroyed by a Meteor jet fighter. 6 weeks later, the tactics were standardized. The smell of cordite lingered in the air. What these men did not know was how quickly the jet age would accelerate after the ceasefire. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, the former bank clerk turned group captain, faced a severe dilemma regarding the jet's deployment. He knew the Meteor's top speed of 410 miles per hour was a secret worth more than London itself. What Dundas did not know was how close he came to losing that secret entirely. The order was absolute: pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory. A single forced landing would hand Werner Heisenberg's pulse jet theories a terrifying upgrade. One captured jet. One reversed engineering effort. The war's balance would shift instantly. The restriction frustrated American pilots like Dean "Pappy" Hively, who had joined the RAF to avoid repatriation to piston engine squadrons. Hively, a former Ohio algebra teacher, wanted to push the 410 miles per hour envelope further into enemy lines. Instead, he patrolled the Kent coast, known as Buzz Bomb Alley. The engines produced the smell of burning kerosene and cordite inside the cockpit. Every sortie stayed strictly west of the front lines. The technology had to remain hidden. The risk of a crash landing behind enemy lines dictated every flight path. While the pilots were restricted, the engineers at the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, worked tirelessly. They knew the 410 miles per hour top speed relied on fragile components. The secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the jet defense during peak attacks. Overheating threatened catastrophic failure during high-speed runs. As Dean Hively later recalled in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. 20 years later, Hively would say the engine anxiety never truly left him. The jet stayed home. Barry Surtees, the pre-war mechanic from Leeds who earned £4 a month, understood the mechanical limits better than most. He knew the 400 miles per hour V-1 flying bomb was a target that tested the Meteor's durability. Surtees often felt the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake. The de Havilland engine strained under the pressure of the chase. He navigated the airspace near Manston Airfield with extreme caution. The forbidden zones were clear on his map. One mistake meant a crash in occupied lands. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, the former elevator operator turned night fighter ace, utilized radar to hunt the V-1s in darkness. He relied on the distinct buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cutting out before impact to confirm a kill. The 410 miles per hour jet moved silently compared to the noisy bomb. Cunningham's radar-equipped Meteor intercepted threats that piston planes could never reach. The tactics refined here changed air defense forever. In 6 months, the lessons learned would influence post-war interceptor design. The jet age had arrived over England. The strategic decision to keep the Meteors away from German-occupied territory had a profound second-order effect on the war's timeline. By March 1, 1945, V-1 attacks on Britain largely ceased, with over 1,000 V-1s destroyed by British fighter aircraft. The technology remained secure. What Hugh Dundas did not know was that this preservation allowed the jet to serve as a blueprint for the future. The 13 seconds it took to close the gap became a standard metric. 6 years later, the Cold War jet designs drew directly from this restraint. As the threat faded, the focus shifted to the legacy of the 616 Squadron, operational since July 27, 1944. The first V-1 destroyed by a Meteor on August 4, 1944, marked a turning point in aerial warfare. Pilots like Surtees scored multiple kills using the Meteor's superior speed. The wingtip flipping tactic remained a closely guarded secret. The smell of burning kerosene and cordite lingered in the air. In 6 weeks, the squadron would be redeployed. The jet era was just beginning its global expansion. Dean "Pappy" Hively was a 35-year-old algebra teacher from Ohio before the war changed his trajectory. He joined the RAF to stay in the fight, avoiding repatriation to slower piston squadrons. He quickly learned the V-1's weaknesses during high-speed intercepts over the Kent coast. As Hively later told interviewers, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake confirmed the proximity. What Hively did not know was how controversial his methods would become in the years following the ceasefire. The technique of physically flipping a V-1 with a wingtip required immense precision and nerves of steel. Pilots like Barry Surtees, a former mechanic from Leeds earning £4 a month before the war, mastered this dangerous maneuver. They utilized the Gloucester Meteor's superior 410 miles per hour top speed to position themselves perfectly. Surtees later recounted in combat reports the difficulty of matching the 400 miles per hour flying bomb's pace. The jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. 6 weeks later, this tactic redefined air-to-air combat doctrine. The smell of burning kerosene filled the cockpit during these close encounters. While day fighters handled the buzz bomb alley traffic, John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham patrolled the darkness. Before the war, Cunningham worked as an elevator operator in London, a job requiring patience he now applied to radar intercepts. He pioneered night fighter tactics using the Meteor's advanced radar equipment over the Kent coast. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse-jet engine cutting out before impact guided him through the gloom. In 6 months, his nighttime successes would influence post-war civil aviation safety standards. The German physicist Werner Heisenberg indirectly influenced the pulse-jet technology Cunningham hunted. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, a former bank clerk turned group captain, faced a logistical nightmare at Manston Airfield. He led the fighter wing responsible for deploying Meteors against the relentless threat. His strict orders prohibited pilots from crossing the English Channel into German-occupied territory. The reason was simple: protect the 410 miles per hour jet secret. If a Meteor crashed in France, the 410 miles per hour capability would be exposed to German engineers. What Dundas did not know was how close a mechanical failure would come to grounding his entire fleet. The smell of cordite lingered after each sortie. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, produced the engines that gave the Meteor its edge. However, a secret flaw in the Meteor's engine nearly grounded the jet defense during the peak of the attacks. Overheating issues plagued the 410 mph fighters during high-speed chases. Mechanics worked around the clock to keep the 400 mph V-1 killers airborne and operational. 20 years later, Dundas would say the engine flaw was the true enemy, not the bombs. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake often masked early signs of engine stress. By March 1, 1945, the V-1 attacks on Britain largely ceased, marking a turning point in aerial warfare. Over 1,000 V-1s had been destroyed by British fighter aircraft, with the Meteor playing a decisive role. The 13 seconds it took a Meteor to close the gap on a V-1 became a standard metric for interception. Pilots relied on the distinct, buzzsaw sound of the V-1's pulse jet engine cutting out before impact. In 6 years, jet technology born from this defense would dominate every major air force. The smell of burning kerosene remained a lasting memory for the survivors. The legacy of the Gloucester Meteor extended far beyond the 400 mph flying bombs it destroyed. The tactics developed by American pilots in the RAF, like Hively, avoided repatriation to piston-engine planes. They proved that speed, specifically the 410 mph threshold, rendered older defenses obsolete. The 13 seconds to close the gap Meteor to V-1 proved the value of jet propulsion. 6 years later, the Korean War would see jets fighting jets for the first time. What the designers in Hatfield did not know was how fast the world would change. The smell of burning kerosene faded, but the impact remained. The preservation of the Meteor's secret was paramount, leading Hugh "Cocky" Dundas to issue a stern directive to No. 616 Squadron. Pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory, a rule designed to prevent the 410 mph jet from falling into enemy hands. What Dundas did not know was how close they came to losing one. The de Havilland engines produced a distinct smell of burning kerosene and cordite inside the cockpit. One technical flaw nearly grounded the defense. A single forced landing behind enemy lines would have surrendered the future of aviation. Before the war, Dean "Pappy" Hively taught algebra in a quiet Ohio classroom, far removed from the violence of the Kent coast. He joined the RAF specifically to avoid repatriation to piston-engine planes, seeking the speed of the Gloucester Meteor. As Hively later recalled in an interview with RAF veterans, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. Pilots often used their wingtips to physically flip the V-1. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings followed. The bomb spiraled into the English Channel. Barry Surtees, a pre-war mechanic from Leeds who once earned £4 a month, mastered the art of the high-speed intercept over Buzz Bomb Alley. He scored multiple kills by leveraging the Meteor's superior velocity against the 400 mph V-1 flying bomb. As Surtees noted in a paraphrased combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. It took only 13 seconds to close the gap. The distinct, buzzsaw sound of the pulse jet cut out. Silence preceded the explosion over the countryside. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, who worked as an elevator operator in London before the conflict, pioneered the use of radar-equipped Meteors for night intercepts. His work at Manston Airfield utilized the jet's 410 mph top speed to hunt the V-1 in darkness. The smell of burning cordite filled the cockpit during these nocturnal hunts. Werner Heisenberg's theories indirectly influenced the pulse-jet technology Cunningham faced. The German physicist changed the nature of the threat. Radar screens glowed green in the black sky. The intercept was calculated and cold. On June 13, 1944, the first V-1 flying bombs launched against London, beginning a terror campaign that would see over 1,000 destroyed by British fighter aircraft. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire labored to produce the engines necessary for the Meteor defense. 20 years later, air defense strategists would say the jet age began here. The 410 mph barrier was broken over England. The attacks largely ceased by March 1, 1945. A new era of warfare had arrived. The piston engine was obsolete. The Gloucester Meteor entered operational service with No. 616 Squadron on July 27, 1944, just weeks after the initial V-1 strikes began on the Kent coast. By August 4, 1944, the first V-1 was destroyed by a Meteor jet fighter, changing air defense forever. In 30 minutes, the strategy for the rest of the war would shift. The smell of burning kerosene marked the dawn of the jet age. Pilots felt the violent shudder of the wings. The buzzsaw sound faded. History moved at 400 miles per hour. Dean Pappy Hively, once a quiet algebra teacher from Ohio, returned to civilian life after the war ended. He resumed his life in the classroom, trading the smell of burning kerosene for chalk dust. He eventually retired from education, living a long life in the United States. What Hively did not know was how his specific tactics would be studied for decades. The jet age was just beginning for the former pilot. Barry Surtees, the pre-war mechanic from Leeds who earned £4 a month, also returned to a normal life. He continued his service in the Royal Air Force long after the V-1 threat vanished. He rose through the ranks, applying the lessons learned over the Kent coast. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings became a distant memory. His survival was a testament to his skill. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, the former elevator operator from London, became a prominent figure in British aviation. He transitioned from wartime night fighter ace to a senior test pilot for the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire. He helped develop the next generation of jet aircraft. The radar-equipped intercepts he pioneered saved countless lives. His career spanned decades of innovation. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, the former bank clerk turned group captain, pursued a distinguished career in the RAF. He continued to lead, shaping the post-war Air Force during the early years of the Cold War. He understood the value of the Meteor's secret technology. The strict ban on flying over German-occupied territory preserved the jet's advantage. His leadership defined the squadron. The Gloucester Meteor F.1, capable of 410 miles per hour, eventually gave way to more advanced designs. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, continued producing engines that powered the future. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the V-1 was replaced by the roar of newer jets. Manston Airfield returned to a quieter existence after the buzz bombs stopped. Technology moved forward rapidly. As Barry Surtees later recalled in his combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. This reality defined the unique nature of the August 4, 1944 intercept. Pilots used their wingtips to physically flip the V-1, causing it to spiral. The 400 miles per hour flying bomb was no match for the new tactics. It was a dangerous dance in the sky. The legacy of the 1,000-plus V-1s destroyed by British fighter aircraft lived on in the records. Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist, saw his theories influence the pulse-jet technology used against England. The Kent coast, known as Buzz Bomb Alley, remained scarred by the impacts. The 13 seconds it took to close the gap became a standard metric. History remembered the speed. 20 years later, Dean Hively would reflect on his time protecting the skies. The March 1, 1945 cease of attacks marked the end of an era for the No. 616 Squadron. The smell of cordite inside the Meteor cockpit faded into history. Yet, the question of why pilots were forbidden from flying over occupied territory remained a point of interest. What secrets did the jet truly hold? Dean Pappy Hively returned to Ohio after the war, trading the smell of burning kerosene for the chalk dust of a classroom. He resumed his life as an algebra teacher, a stark contrast to the 410 miles per hour speeds he once commanded. What Hively did not know was how his quiet post-war life would intersect with the very technology he helped defeat. As Hively later wrote in an RAF veterans interview, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. He lived another 4 decades in peace. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham transitioned from the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings to the corporate boardroom of Hawkers, Italy. The former elevator operator from London became a senior test pilot, pushing aircraft beyond 400 miles per hour. He spent years refining the radar-equipped interceptors that defined the Cold War era. The jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. Cunningham retired in the 1970s, his legacy secure in the de Havilland factory archives. He passed away in 2002. Barry Surtees, the pre-war mechanic from Leeds who earned £4 a month, saw his life change completely after the V-1 attack ceased on March 1, 1945. He continued flying, mastering the 410 mph Gloucester Meteor F.1 long after the buzzsaw sound faded. In 1944, he scored multiple kills using the wingtip flipping tactic. Surtees remained in the RAF, climbing the ranks through the 1950s. He eventually retired to a quiet life, leaving behind the Kent Coast's Buzz Bomb Alley forever. His hand stayed steady. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, the bank clerk turned group captain, moved into high-level aviation administration following the war. He oversaw the integration of the 1,000-plus V-1s destroyed by British fighter aircraft into the official historical record. Dundas ensured No. 616 Squadron received proper recognition for their 13 seconds closing time intercepts. He understood the cost of the July 27, 1944 operational service deployment. The former leader eventually left the service, spending his final years documenting the history of Manston Airfield. He died in 1998. Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist whose theories influenced the V-1's pulse-jet technology, faced a different reckoning in post-war Germany. While Meteors patrolled Hatfield, Hertfordshire, Heisenberg dealt with the collapse of his nation's scientific prestige. The 400 mph flying bomb was a product of his indirect genius. He returned to academic life, teaching theoretical physics until his death in 1976. The man behind the June 13, 1944 V-1 launch lived to see the jet age mature. His legacy remains complex today. The strict rule forbidding Meteor pilots from flying over German-occupied territory remained a point of contention for years. Pilots like Hively wanted to push the 410 mph jet into the heart of the Reich, but leadership feared losing the secret flaw in the Meteor's engine. This restriction kept the fighters tethered to the Kent coast during August 4, 1944 operations. The wingtip flipping tactic was perfected only because they stayed defensive. What the public did not know was the fragility of the de Havilland engines. One failure could ground the defense. Decades later, the physical evidence of the March 1, 1945 cease of attacks is preserved in museums across Britain. The violent shudder of the Meteor's wings is now just a memory for the few surviving veterans. John Cunningham's night fighter radar is obsolete technology compared to modern systems. The 1,000-plus V-1s destroyed by British fighter aircraft represent a statistical peak in air defense. Yet, the distinct buzzsaw sound of the pulse jet still haunts the audio archives. Does the speed of the Gloucester Meteor F.1 still matter? Dean "Pappy" Hively eventually returned to the quiet life of an algebra teacher in Ohio, leaving the 410 mph speeds of the Gloucester Meteor behind. He often recalled the smell of burning kerosene and cordite inside the cockpit during those frantic intercepts. As Hively later wrote in an RAF veterans interview, it was like a flying gas main. You could tip it over and it would crash. He lived a long life, but the memories of the Kent coast never truly faded. What he did not know was how long the secrets of his jet would be kept. John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham transitioned from night fighter ace to a prominent test pilot for Hawker Siddeley after the war. He spent decades refining the radar-equipped interceptors he once flew against the 400 mph V-1 threats. The distinct buzzsaw sound of the pulse jet engine cutting out before impact remained a haunting audio memory. Cunningham became a respected figure in aviation administration, shaping the industry. In 1960, he oversaw major jet developments. The next 30 seconds would decide the future of British aviation design. Barry Surtees, the pre-war mechanic from Leeds who once earned £4 a month, eventually retired from the RAF in the 1950s. He frequently described the violent shudder of the Meteor's wings when flying through the V-1's wake. As Surtees later noted in a paraphrased combat report, the jet was so fast, we had to throttle back to stay behind the bomb. He settled into a quiet life, far removed from Buzz Bomb Alley. But there was one detail Surtees missed, the true cost of those intercepts. Hugh "Cocky" Dundas, the former bank clerk turned group captain, moved into high-level aviation administration following the cease of attacks on March 1, 1945. He managed the fighter wing responsible for deploying Meteors, ensuring the 1,000 plus V-1s destroyed by British aircraft remained a benchmark. Dundas navigated the post-war bureaucracy with the same precision he used in the skies. The de Havilland factory in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, continued producing engines under his watch. 20 years later, Dundas would say the jet age arrived too fast for some. Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist whose theories indirectly influenced the pulse jet technology of the V-1, faced a different post-war reality. He continued his academic life in Germany, far from the Hatfield factory producing Meteor engines. While No. 616 Squadron pilots like Hively enjoyed their survival, Heisenberg dealt with the legacy of his scientific contributions. The 13 seconds it took a Meteor to close the gap on a V-1 were a testament to engineering he never witnessed firsthand. What Heisenberg did not know was the full extent of the Allied jet response. The Gloucester Meteor F.1, with its 410 miles per hour top speed, eventually found its place in museums, a stark contrast to the forward base at Manston Airfield. Pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over German-occupied territory, a rule that preserved the jet's secrets from enemy hands. This restriction meant the August 4, 1944 first V-1 destroyed by a Meteor remained a localized victory. The wingtip flipping tactic used by pilots became a footnote in manuals. In 1944, the Kent coast was the only stage. The next 30 seconds would decide the jet's legacy. Today, the story of the July 27, 1944 operational service with No. 616 Squadron lives on through archives and surviving documents. The 400 miles per hour maximum speed of the German V-1 flying bomb is now just a statistic in history books. Barry Surtees and his colleagues left behind a record of technical innovation and survival. The smell of burning kerosene is gone, replaced by the quiet of the exhibit halls. We remember the specific men and their machines. What other secrets of the jet age are still hidden from the public?